Hey Vermont history students, it's time for Unit 8, and Unit 8 is composed of just 2 sections, and I really tried hard to make this the notes for this unit brief and concise, and hope, because I haven't gotten any feedback, but I think some of them have been very long, and my hope was that this unit would really sort of get you with its brevity and be more productive in that way. But it makes me a little worried that what I put down isn't elaborate enough. So I hope that maybe keeping the video short enough I can elaborate upon what's there online. First though, I waited until now to respond to the last town meeting. 3 of you, Jennifer, Evan, and Lindsay, responded to the town meeting documents. 2 uphillers and 1 downhiller, and more than any of the other town meetings before, it was really deeply divided. Basically, you didn't agree about anything. Jennifer was the downhiller, and she did not have a single opinion that was in accordance, consistent with what Lindsay and Evan, the uphillers, said. Now, the idea of town meetings is that they're supposed to be sort of a test of the unity of the air at the time. I don't know how much stock you put in that, but according to the results of town meeting number 3, this is the Gilded Age was the most divided era that we've encountered so far in this course. I think there's a lot to be said for that. So that was cool. I'm looking forward to your responses to the discussion questions. I haven't gotten any yet to Unit 7's discussion question. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And the question for Unit 8 is up. And so there's Unit 8. And this is where we're at, which is the period between about 1906 or so and the end of the 1920s. And there's 2 parts to the 2 sections to this unit. And the first one goes from about 1905, 1906 up to 1920. And then the second one goes is in the 1920s. And I'll begin it by mentioning to you that in 1907, one of the Swedes, the sons of the original Swedes, he was actually Charlie Nielsen was his name, and he was born in Sweden the year before the Swedes came over, which is 1889. So he came over when he was an infant. In 1907, he got married to a woman whose name was Mary Swanson, or Mary Svensson, who was born in 1888 in Sweden and also came over on that same boat, was one of Major Valentine's Swedes. Her dad was named Adolf Svensson, and he moved sometime between 1891 and 1895 to Orange, Massachusetts, which is near in northwestern Massachusetts. And I wonder about this, you know, how much contact all of the Swedes who came over from Glava, Major Valentine Swedes, they were all from the same town, they were all members of the same church. And how much did they stay in contact? Well, they must have stayed in contact to a great extent. I don't think it's a coincidence that Charlie Nielsen married Mary Swanson. That they, you know, even though she lived in Massachusetts for the last 15 years, she had come over on the same boat as him, and their parents were clearly friends. So imagine that scene in Landgrove, Vermont, in 1907. You know, the Westeens were there, and the Andersons were there, and the Svenssons drove up, or rode carriages, the train up from Massachusetts, and it was just a big old Swede party. And they're all intermarried with local families, the Tiffs and the Crandalls, and the other families, the Beebs and all of that, so the Reeds, and so a lot of them must have been there too. It must have been quite a scene. And that's the real sort of authentic uphill Vermont, Landgrove. And Landgrove was a dying town at that time. Its population was going down, down, down. There were still 3 Swedish families living there. The Nyreens moved in 1906 to Pollitt, Vermont. I assume that they came back for Charlie and Mary's wedding. But Landgrove's population was going down, down, down. And if tourism is the biggest industry, is the most important industry in the state, dairying, of course, is still the largest single industry, but tourism is second. And if tourism really determines the state's identity and puts all these demands on downhillers, You know, that the state's greatest asset is what they formerly thought was the worst thing about it, its backwardness. Well then, how do they respond to the fact that a town like Landgrove is basically dying? Its population is old and it's going down, and the young people are not going to stay. It's a town that's facing disincorporation. No one wants to live there anymore. And I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And this can be sort of illustrated, the sort of general dilemma of downhillers. How much preservation is too much? How much development is too much? How do you get the right balance of preservation and development? How do you capitalize on Vermont's backwardness in order to bring it forward without ruining its backwardness? The dilemma can be illustrated by the story of what happened in Rockingham, Vermont. There was this guy. Rockingham is where Bellows Falls is, and up where the old uphill village was, Rockingham Center, there was an old meeting house, and the meeting house had been abandoned in the 1850s because people had moved away from Rockingham Center. So the old Rockingham meeting house which is a beautiful building, had sat in disrepair and looked like it was about to fall down. So this guy, Lyman Hayes, who was a New York City industrialist who bought a summer home in Bellows Falls, he retired and moved to Bellows Falls full time, took a big interest in this meeting house, and decided that he would form the Rockingham Old Meeting House Association and the Rockingham Historical Society, and they would raise money and fix up the meeting house. And other people helped him, but he spent a lot of time up there hammering nails and painting the walls and putting the pews back together. And unfortunately for him, he kept being distracted because with the rise of tourists, more and more tourists were coming back to Rockingham and looking for the gravestones of their ancestors in the graveyard of the church. And the graves many of them had fallen down, and at some point someone had just taken a lot of the gravestones and stacked them in a corner. And people kept coming and asking Hayes, while he's there repairing the meeting house, if he could show them where their ancestors' graves are. And he finally got, just out of the goodness of his heart and his desire to make people happy and do the right thing, he took the gravestones that had fallen over and he alphabetized them. He put them back up again in alphabetical order. So if someone came in and said, my family's name is Abbott, he could be, oh, go look in the A's. My family's name is Smith, go look in the S's. He alphabetized the graveyard. He didn't move the bodies. Anyway, it's kind of weird that way, you know, that he would do that. That, you know, that's sort of like the model, you know, downhillers trying to preserve, but also when they're trying to preserve, changing Vermont. And so there's some primary documents online, and there's the Lore of Vermont's Silent Places and the Vermont Playground of the Creator. And these are publications of the Vermont Bureau of Publicity. And the Bureau of Publicity was formed in 1911 as a state agency to take over for the Board of Agriculture. The Board of Agriculture, if you remember from before, took the lead role in promoting Vermont tourism, selling summer homes, because they had the list of desirable farms, and they just filled that gap. But finally in 1911, Vermont created a Board of Publicity that published these ridiculous pamphlets, like The Lore of Vermont's Silent Places, in order to promote tourism and reverse the state's decline by selling its backwardness. This is also the era when the Long Trail was built. And again, this is downhillers reshaping the state in order to make it so that it is more attractive to outsiders, but only in the way that outsiders want it to be. The outsiders don't want Vermont to be like Massachusetts or Connecticut. They want it to be backward. They want it to be Vermont, in a natural state. And so therefore you have to change Vermont from its backwardness in order to make it what tourists want it to be, which is backward. It's a neurotic state. Summer tourism is that way, and this is how you sort of move towards the present. There's one other thing that I mentioned in there, which is the 1909 tercentenary, the 300th anniversary of Samuel Champlain arriving at Lake Champlain for the first time. And I just want to note to you about that, which is that it's a celebration of a Catholic guy. It's a celebration of a French-Canadian guy. And a big deal was made out of it, but people in Vermont could hardly celebrate Champlain's 300th anniversary. of discovering Lake Champlain without celebrating the state's French-Canadian past. A guy named Oliver Beaupre, who was a pharmacist, he owned a pharmacy right on Church Street in Burlington, was on the Vermont Commission to celebrate the tercentenary. And I tell you this because, I mean, if the state is going to be sold as this magical wonderland of peace and harmony and greatness and resplendent beauty and wonderful Yankee people and all this, where do the French Canadians fit into that? Where do the people who don't have that Yankee background, should they be embraced by this, or do they have to be sort of marginalized and ignored? Well, the fact is you can't ignore them necessarily, because you can't entirely ignore them, because they have been a part of the state's history for 300 years. From the beginning. The state was French. The land that became Vermont was French before it was Yankee. So this is another thing the downhillers have to grapple with. I mean, it's like child labor. Do you ignore the problems that Vermont has, or do you try to fix them? Both ignoring and fixing in the ultimate goal of trying to approximate the ideal that outsiders had. To cap off this first section of the course, I want to note that Charlie Nielsen married Mary Swanson, and they moved to where Mary was from, Orange, Massachusetts. And in 1915, Charlie came back to visit Landgrove, his father's house and his friends and all of that, and there was a big rainstorm, and there was a flood, and they were crossing a stream, and it wasn't until his cousin and his father got back to the house that they realized Charlie wasn't there. The guy got swept away by floodwaters and drowned. He already had 2 kids by Mary Swanson, and she was 3 months pregnant with his daughter, his 3rd child. And that's really sad. I mean, how much Vermont goes on, life goes on, and the reality of it is that Vermont's not perfect. It has all sorts of problems. What do downhillers do about it? Well, that is the topic of the second section of the course, and I won't beat you over the head with the eugenics story. I want you to definitely read the article by Kevin Dan about the eugenics story, which is online in the articles folder, and it tells the very grim story. Now, I thought I'd frame it this way briefly. A woman whose name was Charlotte Nyreen, one of the Swedes, Lottie Nyreen, she came over in 1890. She was 14. And in 1893, when she was 17, she married a loser, this guy Eddie Tift. And they bounced from farm to lumber camp to farm to lumber camp and had 5 kids. In 1920, so she's in her 40s, 44 at this point, she was working as a cook in a lumber camp in a town right near Landgrove, Dorset, that area called Sandgate. And I mean, her husband was in his 50s, and they're living in a lumber camp on top of a mountain in Sandgate. She had her youngest son Richard there with her, but there was no schooling. She also had a young daughter named Mildred who was sent to live with her parents in Paulet. And that's like the grim reality of what life could be like in Vermont. But Vermont in the 1920s reaches its apex of being sold as being ideal. Now, one big reason for this is because Calvin Coolidge was president. And Coolidge seemed to represent, both naturally and also in the way he was packaged and sold, everything that was great about Vermont, everything about its Yankee past and its hard-working, industrious, honest, the whole thing was all about Coolidge. And not to elaborate too much about that, but a lot could be said. Obviously, when I teach the class in person, the construction of Calvin Coolidge's identity and its reflection on the state was a huge factor in Vermont in the 1920s attaining this place at the center of the American identity, really. The 1920s is a decade of really rapid change, mass culture, mass circulation magazines, newspapers, cinema, radio, and as much as those were wonderful things for a lot of people, the pace of life was so fast that a lot of people began to look to the past as a way of resolving the future and accommodating themselves to the future. And Vermont was the beneficiary of that. Such as Landgrove, a guy who was named Samuel Ogden. And Ogden was from New Jersey and taught at MIT and was a very smart guy. He bought a house in Landgrove, where the Swedes are, at least 3 of the families, in the late 1920s, at a time when the house was virtually free and the town was pretty much dying. And he looked around at the town and he thought, you know, I could fix up this town. I could actually renovate some of these old houses and sell them to tourists.